When you hear the name Intel Atom, what do you think of? Is it a netbook barely capable of surfing the net? Or is it one of those cheap Windows tablets that were in all the stores just a few years ago? Or are you a smart kid who knows that in those shiny new Alder Lake chips, those E-cores are actually the latest generation Atom design? Regardless of your answer to the question, I've got something that, chances are, you haven't seen before. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome you to the Sharks Cove. Alright, now that I've probably cut my viewership in half with that song, let's get to business. So, what is the Sharks Cove? In a few words, it's a Raspberry Pi. Well, at least that was the impression that many people got when they first heard of it. To explain more, we need to go back to 2014.
Because you know I'm all about...
Nope. Please, no copyright strikes today. Okay, that's better. Anyway, we find ourselves in the middle of Raspberry Pi mania. The original was released just 2 years ago, with the improved Model B Plus being released this year. Everyone, in techie circles at least, wants their very own cheap pocket-sized Linux computer. That's how it always goes. Make some new tech toy, and everyone wants in. That's not just from the consumer's perspective, but also the business perspective. Yeah, there were, and still are, a ton of designs flooding that newly found market segment, in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But there's one thing you'll find missing, and Microsoft was not happy about it. None of them run Windows. Obviously something had to be done about that. So of course, they released their very own board to solve this massive hole in the market. You Linux nerds can have your Raspberry Pi for $35, but I'll take the Sharks Cove, running a real operating system, and I'll only pay $300? Okay, calling it a Raspberry Pi competitor is not exactly fair. Microsoft never actually intended the Sharks Cove board for hobbyists, and good thing too, because it was like a shark out of water in that market segment. For sure, some units were sold to hobbyists, and Microsoft didn't exactly try to deter that. But the real purpose of the Sharks Cove lies elsewhere. Elsewhere in this video, in fact. Just a couple minutes back. Let me remind you and your little goldfish memory. Or is it one of those cheap Windows tablets that were in all the stores just a few years ago? Well, it still isn't a tablet. Hopefully that much was obvious. But it's a lot closer than you may think. Microsoft was all in on the tablet hype train. Maybe too all in, as anyone with the misfortune of dealing with Windows 8 knows all too well. They believed this was the future of computing, and who at the time was to say they were wrong? The market segment was growing rapidly, and of course they wanted to make their move on it. At the time, few people were interested in a Windows tablet in particular. Market research firms estimated that in the first quarter of 2014, less than 6% of tablets sold were running Windows. This wasn't just a case of consumer apathy, it was also developer apathy. Why develop mobile software for Windows when there's already a massive user base in iOS and Android? You don't go after the little fish, after all. I should probably stop with these fish jokes already. Anyway, it was this problem, the apathy, not the fish puns, that Microsoft needed to fix. So they teamed up with Intel with the self-stated goal of building hardware that would lower the barrier to entry for Windows tablet development. There's already a nice editorial on Intel's newsroom site explaining the path they took, but I'll summarize it for brevity. Intel engineers took a tablet reference platform, intended for Android funnily enough, cost-cut it the best they could, and then broke out all the I/O into user-friendly connectors. The result, of course, being the Sharks Cove development board. So, enough history. What actually is the Sharks Cove in practice? Like I said, it's basically a tablet mainboard in a more friendly form factor for development. This means that the CPU on it is one intended for tablets, the Atom Z3735G. This is a part of the Bay Trail family, with 4 Silvermont cores running at a base clock of 1.33 GHz and a boost clock of 1.83 GHz. It also packed Intel's Gen 7 HD graphics in a 4 execution unit configuration, along with all the peripherals needed to make it a system on a chip. All this fits in a TDP of only 2.2 watts. That means, no, there's not actually a missing heatsink here, if you were thinking about that. There's not even a good way of mounting one on this board. This chip is perfectly capable of running bare die, at least when sitting in open air. Put together, all this is rather impressive given that just a few years prior, Intel's flagship ultramobile platform needed 2 chips pulling double that TDP, used a much slower single core, and a GPU that, well, let's just say I've talked about that in length. Surrounding this chip, we find 1GB of DDR3 memory, 16GB of eMMC storage, a power management chip, and a Realtek audio codec. Oh, and also 7-segment displays for postcodes. After all, this is still a PC. As for the I/O that dominates this board, we have connectors for... oh boy, here we go. Barrel jack and micro USB power inputs, USB debug, USB 2.0 host, buttons for power on, volume up, volume down, screen rotation lock and home screen, HDMI out, MIPI display and camera connectors, micro SD, 3.5mm audio jack, modem audio, RTC clock, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth module, generic sensors, GPIO, I2C, I2S, speaker and microphone, SPI, serial UART, SDIO, camera sideband, modem USB, touchscreen digitizer, battery, and various power rails. Somebody kill me. Well, you certainly can't complain about lack of I/O. Just about every interface is sitting there waiting to be utilized. And that was kinda the point. Again, this board was made for developers. That includes driver developers. With this board, they could easily plug in whatever accelerometer or camera or shit, I don't know, antimatter detector into this thing and develop for it. But that's what it's supposed to do. What can it actually do for us? Really, just about anything you do with any other PC. The form factor may be weird, but it's a pretty standard UEFI based PC, and without any of the secure boot nonsense you inevitably deal with in a finished device. The way of getting to the BIOS may be a little unconventional. It's the power plus volume up buttons at startup, but it works. One thing to keep in mind though is that for some inconceivable reason, Intel only gave Bay Trail machines 32-bit EFI support despite being a 64-bit platform. In practice, this means you're stuck with 32-bit Windows and Linux. There are ways around this, but that's a rabbit hole I personally could not be bothered with. In terms of usability for daily tasks, it's kind of a mixed story. The Silvermont cores in the Bay Trail platform are a massive step up from that in the Bonell-based platforms that directly preceded it. Windows 10 starts up just fine, and it's even kind of fast. But almost immediately, we start running into problems. Remember that 1 GB of RAM? Yeah, that's a problem. Windows 10 itself is marginally fine with it. This already would have been a tight squeeze with Windows 8 and 8.1 like this board was designed for, so Microsoft is due some slim amount of credit for not making Windows 10 too much more bloated. But even with nothing but a single tab of Edge open, we're already sitting at over 60% RAM utilization, and it only stacks up from there. Many of the benchmarks I wanted to run would not launch at all. Many more I just couldn't load on it in the first place because 16 GB of storage, of which more than half is already used by a fresh Windows 10 install. If your needs begin and end with basic internet usage, I guess this thing is still a usable machine? I certainly would not want to though, and I don't think anyone else is lining up to daily a somewhat obscure single-board computer either. But that's not why I'm here, and I don't think that's why you're here either. let's get to the benchmarks. Kind of the Hey!
The game studios.
Oh, yeah, here we go.
Oh!
Oh, no!
Oh, no.
Oh,
No,
great.
no!
Now
It's
moving.
working.
It's moving. That's
That's
pretty good.
Wow. It was that slow. He's pulling inside the carriage from the wrong spot.
That's cinematic. That's cinematic.
So, what did we learn? That an 8-year-old tablet chip isn't very fast? Well, yes. But honestly, it's kinda surprising that it's as fast as it is. Like I said earlier in the video, the Bay Trail platform is a massive step up from its predecessor. In a single generation, Intel's ultramobile offering went from one that could barely run 4-year-old games to one that could barely run a 3-year-old game. Oh. I guess the power consumption numbers make up for that? But after all, it's not actually the Bay Trail chip on this board that makes it interesting. It's everything else on the board. Hardware like this has always been interesting to me. That is, the hardware that your average consumer isn't supposed to see. The hardware only intended for the developers that make the consumer hardware what it is. It's almost by definition unfinished hardware, and it's always rougher around the edges, with quirks that, good or bad, make it unique. It's part of the story of these devices that we see around us every day, and something about being into tech seems to make one inherently interested in seeing what goes into making that tech, and we can see that in the popularity of videos that cover developer kit hardware. In a world where all of our electronics have become increasingly form over function, it's nice to see that equation flipped every once in a while, as well as see our gadgets as they were before they were fully formed. That being said, the cheap Windows tablets that flooded the market may not have ever been as alluring as an iPhone or a PlayStation, but they're still part of a chapter in computing history. Internet-capable devices are both cheaper and more portable than ever, making the information age more accessible to more people, despite social media doing its best to disillusion us of it all. The ability to communicate, learn, and work online, especially given current world events, is a privilege that makes life better for everyone. And one of the most affordable options to gain that privilege, besides used hardware, is one of those Atom-based Windows tablets. And when someone picks up one of those tablets, it's possible that in some part of its development, it can be traced back to the Sharks Cove development board. Thanks for watching. This video might have just been my most demanding one to produce yet, so I genuinely would appreciate it if you would like it, share it, and all of that other stuff that YouTubers traditionally beg you to do. If you really did like it, you probably would also like my video on the GMA 500, the graphic solution in the predecessor to Bay Trail that I alluded to a few times. Thanks again, and see you next time.